So let me quickly introduce the panelists. We have Jerry Kremer, chairman of Empire Government Strategies and partner of Ruskin, Moscow, Faltischek, who served 13 terms in the State Assembly and headed the Ways and Means Committee. We have Michael Dawidziak, I never pronounced that right, founder and president of Strategic Planning Consulting, and a nationally known pollster who usually works for Republicans. Mike has appeared regularly in the pages of Newsday as an opinion writer and appeared on NPR, Fox News, and CNN. Larry Levy, one of my former editors at Newsday, is the Hofstra University Associate Vice President and Executive Dean of the National Center for Suburban Studies. He spent 35 years as a reporter, editorial writer, columnist, and PBS host, won many journalism top awards, including being a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And lastly, but not least, Joye Brown, another former editor of mine, who's been a columnist for Newsday since 2006. She joined the paper in 1983 and has worked as a reporter, editor, newsroom administrator, and editorial writer. So we're going to talk a lot about the campaign and how it played out, but since this is primarily a journalist audience, let's start out with Jerry. And how do you think the local media, Newsday, News 12, local and city papers did in terms of covering the campaign?
Yeah, well, I can't help but start first with the national press because aside from the fact that they overglorified the polls to the point where, ad nauseum, I also found that the only best reports that they ever delivered were the ones where they were going from town to town and across the country and talking to real people. And I think that that's really what's lacking when it comes to coverage. Locally, the networks spend a lot of time talking to real people. You really don't have talking heads to the extent that they talk too much. They let the people talk. And there's a lot of lessons that come out of that too. But there's such a contrast between the reporters who spend a lot of time talking about polls, and the ones who really go out in the field and do one-on-one interviews.
Okay. Mike?
Well, as a pollster, I'm going to take a little exception to that. And second of all, it was a very good night for pollsters. I mean, we went into the night with all the polls that I trust anyway, saying that Trump was slightly ahead in all 7 swing states, and he won all 7 swing states. So it really wasn't a bad night for pollsters, quite honestly. But I do understand what Jerry was saying. But I'm going to just address the question a little more locally versus now. I think it served the constituents far better than the national coverage did. I think that the Newsday coverage was, I thought, quite honestly, I would almost say exceptional. And I think the News 12 coverage was also exceptional on the local level, bringing the local debates to people and whatever. I mean, the problem with the way the press covered this election is the problem that everybody has when they run against Donald Trump or they're covering Donald Trump. They spend 90% of their time talking about Donald Trump. That's a mistake that Kamala Harris made in this campaign. This is not 2020 hindsight. This is I'm on videotape saying this back in the summertime. I said that if she spends one dime on negative campaigning, she's wasting her money because the battle of Donald Trump was over a long time ago. She was fighting the battle of Kamala Harris. And she spent most of her time, she made the same mistake most people do when they run against Donald Trump. They spend most of their time talking about him, and that's what the national press did as well. And what you do is you elevate him in importance in people's minds. You make him the main player in the room, and that affects the election.
Okay. Larry?
I agree with both Jerry and Mike to a large extent. I do think that the national media did spend more time trying to do the kind of pieces you described, Jerry, more so than we've seen in the past, because they had been criticized for doing exactly what Jerry said they did. I also think that, as Mike said, polls were almost uncannily accurate. I mean, you could cherry pick some crazy outliers like the one in Iowa that had Harris ahead by 3 points. But by and large, the averages showed that they were well within the margin of errors. Problem with the polls, twofold. One, again, getting to what Jerry was talking about, is an obsession with horse races. Who's ahead? Who's behind? when it violates the most important thing about polls. It's a cliche, but they are snapshots in the moment. They are not predictive. They just give you an idea of where things are. And if they focused more on the issues in the poll rather than who was ahead and who was behind, it would be more valuable. And if they would also understand that the other criticism, rather, sorry, is locally. I mean, I love Newsday. I think Newsday did a really good job, particularly considering the resources they had. I mean, when I was there, it was a so-called golden age. You had 10 people covering one race when I started out, and it was probably more coverage than people wanted to read. But the use of polls on Long Island with samples of 500 and then trying to do crosstabs off of them explains how you get a poll that says Laura Gillen was 12 points ahead of Anthony D'Esposito. She ultimately won, which is an interesting thing to talk about because obviously there's some ticket splitting going on there. But I just used to look at those polls, and when the reporters would call me as a talking head, I would say, I don't want to go on the record because all I'm going to do is complain about what a lousy poll it is. And I like Siena, I like Greenberg and Levy, I like, but it's nuts. It's just absolutely nuts and distorts what people are getting. That's my little rant.
Well, my thing is this. People always ask me, who's going to win? I never predict anything because I think what it comes down to is what motivates people to go out and vote. And it could be anything from the weather to anything else. So, and I think that in this particular case on Long Island, what you knew was that the Republicans had a really, really good stretch in terms of wins on Long Island. And they had done so in crafting messages that went to Republicans, Dems, and to the big old blanks across Long Island, which is why you have such a large number of Republican office holders out here. For this election, I know they went hog wild out there getting their people out to vote. So even that Gillen poll may have been accurate at one particular point in time, but with the sophistication and Mike can speak to this of elections now and what information parties have in real time. If you build a good enough web out there or a good enough base, you can get people out. You know who hasn't voted, and you can just get them out. And I think on Long Island, the Republicans did a far better job of that, as they have over the past several election cycles than the Dems did.
So were there any surprises for any of you on Long Island? I mean, did you all expect Gillen to win?
I'll tell you what I was surprised about. I still can't figure out. The first congressional district has had 4 Democratic congressmen and 3 Republican congressmen in the last 25 years. And when they presented the reapportionment, the redistricting plan, I don't understand how they allowed the tweaking of the first congressional district to make it tilt more towards the Republicans. I mean, this was supposed to be a plan that the Democrats had the most to say and the Republicans had a part. But I just can't figure out why they allowed that tweaking to take place, which I think makes that district forever Republican.
What do you mean they had the most to say? They had everything to say. They controlled the whole process.
Well, they let the Republicans talk. They just didn't listen. But
the other part about it, Special Master had come up with something that was just crazy. So I think what they were doing is, yes, they were in charge of everything, but they didn't want to end up with a Special Master again. So I think that they thought that they would do what would not be challenged or successfully challenged. I mean, they probably could have done a little better on that first district, but I think that was probably the goal there.
No, they couldn't have ended up with a Special Master.
I'm not sure I agree with Jerry about it being forever unwinnable for Democrats. I mean, I agree with you. It was a tweaking, and the tweaking adjusted it by a percentage point or two, and Lolota won by 10 or 12 points. I think it was more a matter of the reason that I think Harris lost in the end, and why turnout dropped for Democrats by. And if you want to talk about a surprise, what surprised me was with the incredible investment in a get out the vote effort, 16 to 20 million fewer Democrats came out. It just, I don't get why that happened, except that they decided, you know what? we can't take a chance on Harris. We never vote for Trump. We'll stay home. That kind of thing. Donald Trump did a great job of bringing out every single last one of his supporters in red areas, blue areas, purple areas. If there was a MAGA person hiding under a bed in the Bronx, he brought them out. What he also succeeded in doing, though, was just getting little slivers in the swing areas, like Long Island. Long Island is a perfect example of that. Donald Trump improved his percentages in Nassau by, 10 points, 8 points? But he didn't get a single, literally a single, one more vote than he got 4 years ago. Yeah. It was a fall off for the Democrats, and all the turnout, to the extent you can do it with the data we have now, were drops in Democratic or Democratic-leaning communities. So, ironically, with all this stuff about issues and stuff, it's really the ability of the local parties, Joe Cairo's, operation versus Jay Jacobs' operation, to get out the vote, which killed them in 23, 22, and 21. So it really was a prosaic failure in Nassau. Yet at the same time, there was a lot of ticket splitting. How do you explain Swazi and Gillen and, my God, Judy Griffin winning an assembly seat from a fairly well-respected Republican incumbent? Wacky, wacky year.
Yeah, no, turnout almost always is going to be determined first and foremost by enthusiasm and how enthusiastic your voters are. And clearly Democrats were not enthusiastic. And I'll explain why that Gillen poll was so off, is that there is a 38%, normally there is a 38% bump in Democratic turnout in that district in a presidential year as opposed to the off-year congressional elections. And when you poll people, you can know specifically that they've come out in presidential years, and they'll answer the poll that they're going to vote. But if they weren't enthusiastic, they just weren't going to. And there's really just no way you can factor that in in your polling. So, I mean, that's where polling can go drastically off if people are answering it like they think they should. Yeah, I'm going to vote, but they're really not.
Well, let me ask you.
I think the biggest problem is you've got a lot of people who enroll as Democrats, particularly in the 5 towns, still enrolled as Democrats in the 5 towns and haven't voted Democrat in 10 years, particularly Orthodox Jews. And the poll was in the field during one of the Jewish holy days, and you missed all those Orthodox Jews. So if your model called for 75 Jews to be in the poll, you're going to get moderate. You're going to get the normal moderate to liberal Jews, and that's going to throw a poll off tremendously. I don't know if that makes sense to anybody else, but
Larry, I ran in the 5 towns as well as, and when the Orthodox population was growing, and I managed to always win that one because as a local candidate who was physically present at everything, people accept you. But once you get to the national level, where there's a different strata under discussion, they just tend to vote Republican now. Period.
Well, you also were one of the most powerful people in the state, and were able to deliver a lot for your district too.
So how did Gillen thwart the red wave? Was it the nepotism issue for Esposito or something else?
I don't really think that had any effect whatsoever. I didn't think it was going in, and I don't think it had any effect at all in the end result. I think people were much more focused on policy like immigration, inflation, abortion rights. I mean, I think they were much more going to vote on that than whether he hired his fiance's daughter or whatever. I don't think anybody voted on that at all.
It didn't help him, Michael.
And let's face it, it's Nassau County. They're used to this sort of stuff.
Yeah, no, but that's the thing. If you talk to Republican officials quietly and privately, they will tell you that this was a step beyond that's going to cause more scrutiny of everything that goes on in terms of patronage. I think in this close race, I think this was the difference. I really do.
Yeah. But I want to pick out a race. That's the assembly race up in the town of North Hempstead. And Gina Suleta lost that seat. Now, there's a situation where the whole campaign was outsourced to the Democratic State Campaign Committee to in effect, run that. And they can run a campaign and put money into it, but they can't do the door-to-door and the kind of things that a local organization would provide. And the Democratic Party, I think, let her down because she just didn't get the backup that she needed from the party. And she was relying on Albany to carry it at the same time that Albany is carrying 14, 15, 16 other races around the state, which makes it pretty tough.
But having been involved in a lot of Senate and Assembly races, I will tell you the Senate committees, both, and I'm not just talking on both sides of the aisle here, they come in and they push everybody out. And they say, we're controlling how the money's going to get spent. We're going to control how the campaign's going to be run. They bring in their own consultants. I mean, I've been pushed aside many a time in these Senate and Assembly races. And to agree with what you just said, though, Jerry, I think the same thing happened in the first SD. I mean, they spent an enormous amount of money on Sarah Anker. I mean, I might even set a record for a Senate race, actually. In the history of New York, they spent a ton of money, and she got blown out. And again, they spent the money, but I think again, no ground game. Yeah.
So for the local races, was it the same issues as it was nationally, or did Long Island have different interests?
Slightly. I will tell you something that again, when you hear polls, I'm going to defend polling whenever I get an opportunity. But when you hear polls disseminated in the press, that's different than how we read them. When we're reading them, first of all, we don't even hardly pay attention to the top lines at all. We're just looking at the crosstabs. We really couldn't care, then tri-tabs even. Could care less almost about the top lines. So we're really kind of digging into it. So when you hear these polls like reported on nationally, they're only looking at the top lines and reporting it. They're giving you they're basically giving you the junk food of the poll. We really tend to dig in. And one of the things we found out on Long Island, and we knew about, and the press never picked up on it, because again, you'd have to is the red wave that we'd had on Long Island for 3 years that was being driven by Albany progressive policies. That feeling was still there. If you were an independent voter and you were looking to sway a little bit, you still had that anti-progressive Albany feeling, and you were leaning Republican. They weren't voting for Donald Trump; they were voting against the Democrats. And nationally, I'm going to say the same thing. I don't think Donald Trump won this campaign. I think Kamala Harris lost it, or the Democratic Party as a whole lost it. I look in the beginning of this year, 70% of Americans polled said they didn't want it to be Biden or Trump. That would say that both of them were eminently beatable by a new face. And the problem was that they picked somebody who had a 38% approval rating when they picked her. The party bosses would have never chosen somebody with a 38% approval rating. They did it in the back room. And then you pick somebody who had to defend Biden's policies, which were unpopular. Basically, they went back to Chicago trying to avoid the bloodbath they had in 1968, and they got the same exact result: a vice president who had to defend a sitting president's unpopular policies.
Okay, well, Mike, you brought up a good question. I think a lot of people are talking about is what could have they done, or should have they done differently? I mean, obviously, if Biden, there's a difference of opinion about whether if Biden hadn't run for a second term and had dropped that earlier, whether that would make a difference.
It's hard because you can't just go back and do it over again.
Yeah, but if you could, what should have they done differently?
Well, look, I've been in the winning and losing locker room for President of the United States, and and I always say you learn a lot more from a loss than you do a win, which is good news for the Democrats. The Democrats, believe me, are learning a lot more from this loss than the Republicans are from their win. Because you win, you think you did everything right, and of course you never do. And when you lose, you really do analyze what went wrong and what you did do wrong. But the first thing is, yes, Biden should have stuck to being a one-term president. He should have stuck to the commitment, and then things would have been completely different. Once that didn't happen, everything kind of tumbles out from there. Secondly, when he finally does drop out, and again, I said this at the time. I know Larry disagreed with me at the time, but I said they should have an open convention. It would have been exciting. It would have been thrilling. They would have dominated the news cycle for 4 weeks. You would have done to Donald Trump the worst thing you could possibly do to him. You would have shut him out of the news cycle for 4 weeks. And
except all they would have done is talk about how they're the one to beat Donald Trump.
Well, regardless, and they might have come up with a better candidate. Look, one of the problems with the Democratic Party is that, and this is going on for a long time. This erosion's been going on a long time. This is the party of Jefferson. All right. Jefferson believed the agrarian farmers had all the wisdom in the country. That was all centered in the farmers. Okay. 30 years ago, the Democrats lost support of the farmers. And they didn't really seem to care that they did. Then they lost the truckers. Then they lost basically everybody who listens to country music. Okay, if you listen to country music now, you vote Republican. Okay, and all of that they just didn't seem to care about. And as they're getting tagged as a coastal elitist party, they now have erosion from blue collar union workers. And there's the death blow. And there's Donald Trump taking the popular vote. And they've got to address this erosion. I mean, Joe Manchin shouldn't be an outlier in the Democratic Party because he defends a poor state and hardworking coal miners. He shouldn't be an outlier in the party, but he is.
Well, I
You know,
think
if the Democratic Party does not get back to being the party of the working person and address that geographically and get back to the center of the country, and an open convention, maybe you would have gotten a Gretchen Whitmer. Maybe you would have gotten an Andy Beshear. Maybe you would have gotten an Amy Klobuchar, somebody from the center of the country that might have won. And it was different. It didn't have to defend Biden's policies.
Michael, as a still sitting Democrat, I think the problem with the Democrats historically has been it's the party of talk, and not the party of listen. Okay.
Oh, you're absolutely right, Jerry. You are 1,000% correct. I always say Republicans are very good at tapping into how people feel and then taking advantage of it. Now, by the way, that's sometimes the worst instincts possible. That might be tapping into racism, sexism, and greed, but it doesn't matter. They're really good at tapping into how people feel and then using it. Democrats want to tell you how you should feel.
Yeah. Well, and unfortunately, as the Democrats are still forming circular firing squads, to try to figure out what happened. I think if they all sat down and said, frankly, what mistakes did we make, instead of saying who was wrong, they'll become a better party. But they got to learn to do that.
Oh, listen, things go in cycles. Somebody said to me on election night, 4 years goes by a long time and really fast. And I said, no, 2 years. 2 years to the midterms.
Yeah. Yep.
And historically, when a president comes in and sweeps both houses, they lose it in their first midterm. Happened to Eisenhower, happened to Clinton, happened to Obama. Historically, that's what happens. So 2 years goes by very fast.
Yeah, and as we can see, the president-elect is now building up a case for the Democrats 2 years from now.
Well,
absolutely. I mean, I think the less the Democrats do, and the less they talk, as Jerry suggests, the better off they'll be, because the farmers, when they see the tariffs and the lack of migrant labor to do their fields, the
patients,
the union people, when they see the anti-union union busting policies that come in, I think that if Democrats, basically, as well as Republicans, would understand that the Republicans succeeded in painting the Democrats as the extremists, which made them seem like they were the moderates, whether they were or weren't. The Democrats tried to do it, but in the end, they weren't as convincing. I'm not sure with hindsight any Democrat could have won, even a Klobuchar or Whitmer, because of the mood of the country on the economy and on migration. I don't know how they get away from that. I thought that there was a path, and when you and I would discuss on TV, Mike, and but looking back, I don't see how it was. I just want to add one thing. I'm going to pull the lens back for a second. This is national elections are determined for 30 years now by suburban voters, with almost no exceptions. And Long Island was the weird outlier in 2022, New York, when the rest of the competitive suburban districts were held by Democrats, and 5 or 6 in New York went the other way because of all the things Mike was talking about, the post-pandemic pain. So here we are now in 2024 after 3 wipeout years by the Republicans that somebody else mentioned. But here in 2024, what do we have? We have Donald Trump getting no more. We got a few more in Suffolk. Suffolk's an ex-urban, really. It doesn't fit the same model for a lot of reasons, at least Eastern Suffolk. But we had Donald Trump getting no more votes than he ever got. You have 2 Democratic members of Congress winning competitive seats. You have 3 Democrats upstate winning competitive seats. We have, again, Judy Griffin. Nothing against her, but she didn't even get Newsday's endorsement. How did she win? What that tells me is that we're at an inflection point. on Long Island and even in the rest of the country, where you saw slivers of support move to the Republicans, but not really flip, 10 points of Latino men, 5 points fewer of women that were predicted. But fundamentally, these places are still in play. Long Island, the pain that Mike was talking about, may be dissipating. The Democrats have learned how to get out votes in certain campaigns. They certainly did for Suozzi and for Gillen. So I think we're at one of those points where it's possible that the pendulum that for 30 years had been moving from red to purple to light blue on Long Island with a timeout after the pandemic. Are we going to go back once the pain fades in people's echoes? The energy gets drained from it as a tax? Or are we moving 30? We are on another big pendulum cycle where in 30 years it'll be my mother's and father's suburbs again. I mean, this is, maybe real people don't care about this, but political scientists, pundits, professors, this is an important question.
Well, but real people do care about governance, and I think that's something that we're overlooking here. You've got Republican town supervisors, 3 in Nassau County, and 4 of the 5 most populous towns in Suffolk, Republican governance, Republican town boards, right? And if you had to look at it in toto, they're doing a decent job governing. And they're governing, and so people see Huntington used to be Democrat, Republican. We have the town board. We have our kerfluffles over, like the Melville project and whatnot. But you also see the Republicans say in Huntington, naming streets after Black pioneers or bringing more people in, opening things up a little bit more. Now, I don't get me wrong, patronage to the max, because that's the name of the game on Long Island. But in terms of governing, in terms of taking a look at people and how they're governed here, I think the Republicans have been doing a decent job. And I think people are looking at that. Look at Ed Romaine in Suffolk County, right? Suffolk County goes red. We just had a hate incident there, right? Involving a suspended detective from a village police department. And you had the Republican district attorney turn up and say, hey, we're not doing that. And you had a Republican county executive say, hey, we're not doing that. So is this the scary red, MAGA movement here, or is this good governance? And I don't think you can sort of pretend that, there's one without taking a look at the other. And I think it's the governance that's closer to people on Long Island.
Joye, you mentioned Trump and the Republicans in Congress. If they are perceived as not governing, or they're perceived as governing as extremists, or not keeping promises that made moderates, say, hey, maybe I'll take a chance on these guys. As Mike suggested, they'll be gone in 2 years.
Joye, you mentioned something about supervisors. I was at a breakfast yesterday with the supervisor in Huntington, and I did a double take a few times. He sounded like a Democrat. He really did. He was talking about housing. He was talking about zoning changes and being willing to take on controversy. And I'm just saying to myself, wow, what a change.
Well, if you would hear the same thing in Iceland.
I'm sorry. In moderate swing suburban areas all over the country, it's the Democrats who sound like Republicans and the Republicans who sound like Democrats that tend to be the most successful. And that's the key for one party to hold Long Island or the other party to begin to take it back. And I don't know that the Democratic Party has learned that lesson. And from the kind of appointments I'm seeing in Washington, I don't think the Republican Party has learned that lesson.
Well, here's the mistake. We've talked about what we should learn from an election result. Here's the mistake that both parties almost always make. When they win, and they win big, they think the electorate has actually changed.
Right.
They think the electorate has actually become more conservative or more liberal. And it's never the case. They're just voting reactionaries, particularly the moderates and the soft Republicans, soft Democrats, and the independents. They're just reacting to their quality of life issues and saying, I'm pissed off with the Democrats this year, I'm going to vote Republican, or vice versa. But the electorate doesn't change. The electorate is the same. And on Long Island, that means a very moderate purple electorate. One of the interesting things to look at in this election is that 3 of the 4 congressional candidates ran ahead of the presidential candidate. That's unusual. You don't usually run ahead of the top of the ticket. Andrew Garbarino ran through 3 or 4 votes ahead of Trump, and Gillen and Swazi both ran ahead of Biden. Now that's pretty telling.
Ticket splitting.
So do you folks think that these inroads that Trump made with Hispanics, young black males, white suburban women, is that a permanent shift, or is that just a peculiarity of this election?
It is
In
absolutely
Trump?
not a permanent shift. It is reactionary to this campaign in this time. And I mean, look, it might be saying, hey, we're more up for grabs than we used to be, and you have to compete for our vote. I mean, I think that was clearly a message in the black men vote, quite honestly. That we're tired of being taken for granted and what have you. But the bottom line is this a permanent shift that they're going to become, red people start wearing red hats? No, that's not. That's the mistake parties usually make. They think the electorate changed. It didn't.
Well, I think this election is going to force the Democrats 4 years from now to stop using cookie cutter resumes and picking their candidate, if you will, and look for people, if you will, who they may think is an outlier. It may be the farmer, it may be the governor of Kentucky, it may be somebody else who's a successful union leader, but who's loved by both parties. I mean, they're going to be forced, to start re-looking at the kind of candidates they pick. Unfortunately, it may not be a woman, but the fact of the matter is that the Democrats have a lot of soul searching to just not follow the same cookie cutter 4 years from now.
Can I just jump in here for a second? I'm going to ask you, Mike. We keep talking about Republicans and Democrats. Do you see that the electorate increasingly doesn't view themselves that way?
Unquestionably.
Doesn't believe in, you have to be one or the other. I mean, if you take a look at Nassau County, look at the number of blanks there are out there. I mean, what's your thought on that?
Gallup has been tracking self-identification by party nationwide forever. And I have been looking at this poll forever. Okay, when I first started looking at the poll, maybe about 25% or so of Americans define themselves as independent. It is now 46%. The largest plurality of Americans say they do not belong to either major party, closing in on a majority soon, because it's been growing every year. And that is closing in on a majority soon. And that's where eventually you're going to have to go to open primaries and things like that across the board that doesn't disenfranchise the majority of Americans. And that's what's going to happen. That's the situation we're going to have in a relatively short amount of time. So you're unquestioned, Joy. You're absolutely right.
And on Long Island, what I'm saying is, and the reasons Republicans have been so successful here, in my view, is that they craft their message not to Republicans, but to Long Islanders, because in Nassau, Republicans are not the majority and haven't been for almost time immemorial now. So it's in the message that they do, and they're not saying, hey, be a good Republican. What they're saying is they're crafting messages that people are going to take in that are not registered Republicans. It's the only way they can win.
And the irony to that is that back when I first started in the 1970s in this game, Democrats were much better at talking to independents than Republicans were, because they had to win, because the registration back then was 50% Republican, 25% Democrat, 25% independent. The Democrat needed every one of those independents in order to win. So they were much better back then at talking to independents.
Right. One of the I think, Joy, you're really onto something there. That the Republicans realize more so than it seems the Democratic, at least by their messaging and organizing efforts, that you do have to build a bridge from your conservative base in these swing suburbs like Long Island to moderate in the middle, and they focus on either stuff that will scare them into feeling that the Republicans have the right answer, or that, as in the case of Ed Romaine, who I think really does qualify as what he likes to call himself, a green Republican. He takes this seriously, the cliche that there's no Democratic way to clean a street or Republican. He actually believes that. Mm-hmm. But of course we know there's a Democratic way to do it. I'm joking, but and related to this, and I thought you were going to go to this, Joy, but it's implicit, I think, in what you were saying, is that the silver lining, I know Democrats don't see this, but I think the silver lining in losing the sliver, and they really are slivers overall when you compare to how many people still voted Democratic, but the slivers of losses of Black and brown people and Asians as well, Blacks, Latinos, Asians, it should be taken as a lesson that you can't take these folks for granted, and that you have to learn how to talk to them, not as Black people, Latino people, and Asian people, but as working class, middle class, upper middle class people. In other words, you have to learn to talk to them like you talk to white people. Problem for the Democrats is they haven't sort of figured out how to talk to white people. So they have a lot of remedial work to do in the messaging and in the organizing and the targeting.
Listen, Larry, there are Latinos who voted for Trump who say, I am still a Democrat. Okay?
Right.
They haven't given up on that label. They don't want to consider themselves Republican, but they just voted for who they chose to.
But a lot of these percentage shifts were a reflection of turnout and not necessarily getting a lot more votes. I know in the city it was a little more dramatic, but this if you want to go circle all the way back to coverage, I think the misunderstanding of the difference between the word flipping to or flipping toward. What we saw with all these relatively new Republican voters this cycle in trying out the Republicans was moving toward. But no group that I'm aware of, including on Long Island, actually flipped, where a Democratic voting bloc that was giving a majority blue became red. And around the country, actually, the only bloc that flipped from blue to red were the suburbs, which is interesting. Suburbs has flipped back and forth over the last 3 elections after trending heavily toward the Democrats for 30 years. That's where the action is.
Well, but the other
Go ahead, Joy.
I'm sorry, Jerry. Well, the other thing about it is, if you took a look at the numbers, Donald Trump was more successful in getting, no vote, people who rarely voted or people who normally would not vote out. So it was more than just the regular folks coming out to vote. He managed to be persuasive enough to get people who would have sat home out to vote.
Yes, but I think, Joy, the reason why he succeeded is he took his message of grievance with a very well-financed portion of their campaign and decided to invest in people who don't traditionally vote very much, who are blanks and don't necessarily have a consistent voting record. But I mean, there was a constituency out there to be mined, and he mined it.
And what is that expression about the handmaiden of necessity? I think Trump realized early on that he had virtually no chance to get the typical moderate suburban swing voter. And that what he had to do was not only bring out the MAGA base in red areas, but again, like I said before, he had to find, the few red people even in Democratic areas and bring them out. And the only other chance he had was exactly what Jerry described, which was to look for just enough people who fit that profile, but generally didn't participate. And again, I'm sort of parrot Jerry, but they were just successful enough at doing that. But he still didn't get any more votes than he got 4 years ago. I mean, a million more out of 300 million. I mean, this was about Democrats losing, or Democratic leaning independents losing interest, faith, confidence in Kamala Harris.
Well,
the House didn't change. The House is the same number of votes separating them. The Senate flipped by three seats that were anachronisms, of Democrats who held on to them because they were incumbents in very red states. The country is at that crossroads, an inflection point. And if the Republicans think they've got a mandate, or the Democrats think they should blow it up and go even more progressive, one or the other is going to have a lot of problems.
Mike, can I ask you?
Go ahead, Joy.
Mike, Larry brought up enthusiasm. Do you think that some of these Dems were so convinced that Harris is going to win that they didn't bother to come out?
Absolutely. That's absolutely going to be the case in certain areas. But again, when we talk about any kind of vote, when we're talking about Hispanic vote, one of the mistakes we make, and this is a product of looking at polls, we look at votes like they're monolithic, and they almost never
Yes.
are. In fact, they never. In fact, take out the almost, they never are. I mean, we had to learn this lesson about the Hispanic vote years ago. They always say, and then, well, wait a minute, whoa. Puerto Rican vote is different than the Cuban vote, which is different from the Mexican vote, which is different from the El Salvadorian vote. It's very rarely monolithic, and then it breaks down even within there. So, but I think, again, when we look at where did the Harris campaign fail? Well, their failures were probably going to be different in Michigan and Wisconsin than they were in Pennsylvania.
Right.
Pennsylvania is going to be a turnout problem. I guarantee they're going to look at that and say, we didn't get the turnout out of Philly and Pittsburgh we needed. I mean, look, I've done several statewide races in Pennsylvania. No, it's not rocket science. Republicans going to win the T. Democrats got to get really heavy turnout in Philly and Pittsburgh. It's just that's the key to winning Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania is going to end up being a turnout failure on the Democrats' part. Michigan, Wisconsin might be more messaging. It might have been more of a messaging failure as far as, that's where more of, Larry's white suburban middle-class voters make the decision and swing the vote one way or another in those states. That's probably going to be a failure in messaging, I think. So again, you can't look at it like it's monolithic and say, well, this is the failure across the board. I mean, you really have to look at it. 7 states, you got to look at the 7 states state by state and say, well, what went wrong in those states?
Yeah, I have a question for the panel.
Jerry, hold on one second. I just want to say that we are shortly going to try to turn this over to audience questions, and you can ask them. You can go into the webinar chat at the bottom of your screen and type in any questions you want that we can ask the panel. And I also don't want to forget that this is being recorded and will be posted up on the Press Club website in a few days, so people can watch it again, share it with friends. But so far, I don't see any questions. So we'll keep talking. But if you want to ask a question, go to the webinar chat. And there's also a Q&A. Let me see if anybody's there. No questions there either. Okay, so go ahead, Jerry. I'm sorry.
Can I, off of what Mike said, I just looked at the turnout numbers. Around the country, there was a big drop in all 3 of the states that really mattered. I mean, I know everyone says it's 7. But basically, it was Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Harris won those. She wins. It doesn't matter what happened.
That's 270. Those 3 give her 270.
In all 3 states, turnout was equal or a little up. In a lot of the other states and all over the country, it was down. So you're right. It was messaging. I know you said the other 2 for sure. Pennsylvania was messaging, and it was also, I think, a resentment vote. I haven't heard this too much, but against dumping Joe Biden, the favorite son. When you look at those counties around Berks County and the one around Allentown, and I mean, the drop off, the shift to Trump from Harris, same turnout, pretty large. And that's where they lost those congressional seats too.
Do any of you think Biden could have beaten Trump this time around?
No.
He might have done almost as well, but
right. I think we have a question here from.
Yeah. Thanks for doing this. From a journalism perspective, how should we be covering developments as they unfold in the coming weeks based on what we learned from Election Day? From Jim Medora at Newsday.
Yeah, I saw that question. I'll take a crack, although I'm not a full-time journalist anymore. I think that it's really, really important, and it's going to sound like the cliche, but whatever you feel about the candidates and the parties, with all the raw emotion, and maybe you're good at filtering it out, but you're surrounded by friends and families one way or another, you got to work extra hard and hope your bosses will work extra hard to make sure you are as objective, as clear-eyed as you possibly can, but also pay attention to history, the mistakes that both parties have made. Every time they win the White House, they blow it, for the last 10 years, 2 years later. So it'd be great to compare what different presidents have done that caused them to be rejected 2 years later and 4 years later by the electorate.
Well, let me ask, am I the only person who actually read all 922 pages of Project 2025?
No,
Did
you're not. Would you like to see my copy? Yeah.
Yeah, we got a
My
copy
wife
here.
made me print it out because she wouldn't support the Heritage Foundation to buy it. So she actually
I
made
read
me
a lot of it.
print
It's not the
out
whole thing,
every
though.
page of it.
I uploaded in document cloud and took notes on it. But I think, whether every policy, this is the time when promises become policy. And this is a different time from what we've seen because, if you take most people didn't read this thing, but if you take a look at some of the ideas and some of the policies that they want to put forth, I think that it's really important that we in the press, there's the circus element to it. I hope that we got over that with the first Donald Trump term. There's the outrage element of it. I hope we got over it from the first term. These are things that are literally going to impact or potentially impact every man, woman, and child in the United States of America. And I think that we have to take a look at these policies and how these promises and how they turn into policy and what the impact is going to be. At some point in time, we'll have a discussion, Larry, about what objectivity is. I think what's more important here is context. I think clarity. I think authoritativeness.
Yeah.
I think the reason why viewership dropped off at MSNBC, NBC, CBS, because these basically were, they were either pro-Trump or pro-Kamala Harris, and not really getting into as much information as an electorate needed. I think at this particular point, we have to understand that we need to provide information to people as opposed to entertainment for people, which I think is where we went totally wrong the last time around.
Okay,
I'm just going to quickly agree with Joye on keeping your eye focused on what this administration is going to try to do. And this is where the Democrats got to really be careful because they've been so singularly focused on abortion. And Joye said before she doesn't make predictions. Well, I'll make one. Donald Trump isn't going to do anything else on abortion. He's planted the flag. He said he did what he set out to do. He put it back in the states, and everything else now is a loser for him. So he's not going to do anything on abortion. So what you really have to pay attention to are things like getting rid of all the regulatory agencies and the Department of Education and things like that, and see how does that affect everybody's everyday life.
Okay, Gary Louie, who you all know, has asked, aren't you concerned that the very structure of how we vote may be compromised by the end of the Trump term, making this analysis academic? And then he said, he also followed up with a second question, how will AI impact voting patterns? So anybody want to jump on those?
Well, I mean, AI is really no different than anything else. Will people swallow things whole? I've been saying for a long time that one of the problems that we have in our schools and now in our adults is that we stop teaching critical thinking. We stopped teaching our kids, and we have now like whole generations who don't know how to think critically, who don't know when they hear something reported, they don't stop and say, well, how do they know that, and how can they prove that? And there's literally no critical thinking going on, and I don't know how we get honestly, I don't know how we get around that because these people just welcome ready fodder for AI now. I mean, because now you can present. Before they were presenting outrageous lies that you would have said, how could anybody possibly believe it? Now they can present it like it's actual factual. Here's the photographic evidence, and yeah, it is scary. I'll admit that. I mean, when I've seen what campaigns have done to misinform people, without AI, it's scary what might be done with AI.
I don't
want to sound like a cliche, but more education. I mean, Howie Schneider's program over at Stony Brook, I say this as someone from Hofstra, on news literacy is phenomenal. And if every kid on Long Island and around the country had a chance to experience that from kindergarten up through high school, we'd have a very different electorate. They may come to the same conclusion, but the way that they'll be approached will change because the folks selling the message, selling the product, will know they can't sell snake oil. So I think that we really ought to focus on teaching people how to distinguish between fact and fantasy, propaganda and objectivity. again, like it's a cliche, more education, but it's true.
Well, the only problem with that, Larry, is you got to start young. I mean, I was lecturing at Stony Brook School of Journalism the day Howie announced that they were going to teach the students how to identify fake news. And he set me up beautifully. I mean, I had the headline. I just said, what's wonderful about this is that it's like telling you you're going to build an atomic bomb and you've never had a basic science class. I said, so I said, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to talk for an hour and a half. You're journalism students. I said, I'm going to tell you some more stories. I'm going to give you some facts, figures, poll numbers. I said, I want you to stop me and challenge me. I want you to stop me and say, well, how did you know that? Where'd you get that from? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Hour and a half went by. Not one person stopped me. Not one person challenged me. Not one. You can't just start in college. I mean, you got to start this when they're young.
Well, but the other thing to keep in mind here is that, it's never going to go back to the way it was. The question is, how can we educate an electorate going forward? You look on social, I was sold a bill of goods. Well, honey, that's what a campaign is. That's what it is. How do you bridge that gap? How do you get there? Because it's not just kids. It's at this particular point, everybody.
I think, until we're waiting for the generational change that I was spouting, right? I think that, I don't know how to put this, the public is ultimately, even if I think they make occasionally stupid decisions some years or in some races, is ultimately not stupid. I mean, but because think about it. They elect the president, we're going to take a chance on this guy. I'm going to give him a year or two. And if he doesn't do what I think he said he was going to do, or if what he tried didn't work out, I'm going to go to the next. And we're in a very short pendulum right now, where we're going back and forth. And I think that's how the public is correcting its decisions that they make with very little information.
I've often said the same thing. I said the electorate is it's ignorant, but it's not stupid.
Right,
right. And somehow they figure it out, and I don't really know how, but they often do, and they often do the course correction.
By the way, Gary asked a question that we didn't answer, and that is, during the course of the campaign, every time Donald Trump made a statement that people said, what was that? They would say, oh, he's only joking. Well, his latest "I'm only joking" is the slight veiled inference that 4 years from now, there may not be a need for an election because he's entitled to another term. And we're starting this debate, and you'll see, heard it again today on 4 different networks about what does the Constitution mean? And is there a loophole in the Constitution? So the answer is, let's not laugh, because every time he's joking, he means it.
Especially when the Supreme Court will be the ultimate arbiter on whose interpretation is correct. And you wonder, what is it that they're going to do based on what we've seen so far? Yeah,
well, a friend of mine, by the way, who was a Democratic consultant, said that right now they're all just praying Donald Trump does stay healthy for 4 years because they don't want to inherit J.D. Vance. They basically have said, look, Trump's not an ideologue. He is, he's venal. He's a narcissist. But Vance is an ideologue.
I'd love to hear from all you guys on how the impact on the next set of local elections. I mean, when Trump was elected and people were really annoyed at him right out of the box, 2017 there was a revolt, and we got Laura Curran as county executive. Biden gets elected right out of the box. People are annoyed, and in 2021, well, we got Bruce Blakeman, and we got the start of a 3-year rolling red wave. I'm wondering what impact this might have. Would you like to be a Democrat going into this year, or would you rather be a Republican? And if you think you can continue to ride the wave?
Well, I think one word: salt.
What is it?
Salt.
Oh, interesting. Salt, right? State and local tax, right?
I think that if they, get rid of the state and local tax deduction on the federal, which people really, really want out here, then I think that locally Republicans will have something to build on. I think that if salt doesn't go, I think that locally Dems may have something to build on.
Yeah, Joy, my only concern, having been a fiscal committee chair, is that the Congress tweaks the salt a little bit, takes a little bit off, if you will. and gives us a little bit of a break. And then they come back saying to us, well, look, we were succeeded in get some tweaking, give us a chance to get more. So, you just never know how they may play it out.
But and again, this goes to promises and policy. The promise was that they would eliminate it.
Right.
So
Well, they have to reinstate it. It sunsets.
Yeah.
It sunsets. They have to actually have to vote to reinstate it.
That's correct. That's right.
Jerry, I remember when you were head of that fiscal committee and I was a reporter, it used to be Jerry Kremer, chair of the powerful Ways and Means Committee.
That's right. There's always that powerful.
Ways and Means and Jerry Kremer without saying powerful.
I would never let them put a powerful in front of my name. That's very dangerous.
Well, voters probably didn't like it, but journalists, it was our way of signaling that you should read this guy's quote, because whether you think he knows what he's talking about, he's got clout, man. He knows he can deliver.
You know what? I want to go back to Gary's question for just a moment. And Gary, please correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, what we're seeing are challenges to the way things are done, the way things have done, the way systems have worked here in the United States. If you go through, for example, with pardoning the January 6 people, these are people who, attacked the seat of our government, in terms of whether or not he wants to have a second term and how he might go about that. This is not the way things have gone before in terms of, and again, he's in an interesting position because on paper, at least, he's got the executive, the judicial, and the legislative. And if you look at the appointments that are being put in now, I have never taken the military, for example. I don't know what a woke general is, right? But you're going to take the generals out.
Someone gets up at 4:30 a.m., right?
Well, so I do think that Gary has a point in there, which is that in addition to what you might consider what happens if you abolish the Department of Education, what happens if you take and change the way veterans are eligible for and get their benefits, which is in that plan. There are also going to be challenges and changes to systems that we as Americans have traditionally seen the way they operate. And I do think that is something that you need to keep an eye on, that you need to talk about, and that you need to not normalize. If it's weird, you need to say it's weird and explain why. And that's the context as opposed to objectivity you were talking about, Larry.
Yeah, no, you're making a lot of sense.
All right, let me jump in here a second. We're running down on the clock here. I want to get one last question from the audience, but before that, I want to point out, talking about Howie Schneider and the news literacy, the press club is going to be doing a program with him on that subject in January. I'll get the right date here, January 16th. So we can address some of those issues about how to get people to really understand what they're looking at in that program. But let's take one last question from Renee Di Lorenzo from the Long Island Herald. It's a multiple question, but let's just take the last part. What do you think the issue of Israel and Palestine played in the election? So anybody want to jump in on that?
Nationally or locally?
Both, I guess.
Well, first of all, let me just say that the Jewish vote is really not so determinative of the national election, because the pockets of Jewish population don't live in the swing states. So, it probably had very little effect, nationally, except to possibly make him look stronger as an international leader. And one of the failures, I think I see this more as a Harris failure than a Trump success. And I kept saying it over and over. I don't know why she isn't talking more about Ukraine. Why isn't she speaking of, now maybe I just said I'm saying that because I'm part Ukrainian, I don't know, but I'm saying, saying this is a golden opportunity for her to look stronger on the international stage, and she didn't do it. So maybe it had some effect of making him look stronger as the leader of the free world. But as far as the Jewish vote is concerned, it had no effect.
I got a call from a reporter who was working on a story about this. I'm not going to say who it was, and I'm not sure I can remember who it was. But I tried to look at the election district maps and try to come up with an answer. And I realized that that the only Jewish population now that is clustered beyond a shadow of a doubt, and if you see a vote in those EDs, you can be sure it's Jewish, are Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox in Jerry's old stomping ground in the 5 towns. So what I saw was turnout was Republican votes up to 82%, like you'll get in Brooklyn, with the Lubavitcher Rebbe's. So this was a very strong vote. But these are voters who vote Republican from president on down, a dog catcher. These are religious conservatives. They vote Republican. There's almost no way, unless you do a lot of focus grouping, a very high sample polling, to find out how the Jews who tend to vote Democratic really went. I have anecdotal chatter in talking to people that the Democrats did lose some moderate Jewish votes over the perception that maybe the party isn't as sensitive as it needs to be on anti-Semitism. But it's really hard to determine, I think, if we're really being honest, and that the Democrats were caught in an awful position. They lost Jewish votes on Gaza, and they lost Muslim votes on Gaza. And so, what are you going to do about that?
But the end result, it had no effect electorally for president. I mean, locally,
maybe in Michigan it did.
All right, I think we'll stop here. We have a press club rule that we quit at an hour. Even if people want more, leave them wanting more. So I want to thank our 4 panelists for a very interesting discussion. And as I said, this will be posted on PCLI.org in a few days for people that want to share it. But thank you all, and thanks for the 25 or so people that tuned in. Plus, this was promoted nationally by SPJ, so there could be people around the country checking us out also. So thank you all, and have a good night.
Yeah, thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night and good luck.